All right. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the other panelists. That was really fantastic. So the next panel, we are going to be talking about blockchain ethics. So it's probably best to think about blockchain ethics as an extension of some of the other tech ethics that we have, that we talk about in the world. You know, we have AI ethics, machine ethics, and now we have blockchain ethics. So I first started thinking about this and realizing that there was a gap when I was at a conference maybe a year or two ago, and I heard Rhys Lindmark give a little talk about blockchain ethics, and we're fortunate to have him here on this panel. But he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, you know, Rhys, I don't want to put words in your mouth or feelings in your heart or anything, but he said, if we if we think that blockchain is going to be important, I think he said, if it's going to have even 10% of the impact that the internet has had on the world, we need to start developing it responsibly, and we need to start now. And I think we're all here because we think that blockchain is really going to matter, but still relatively little thought has been put into trying to figure out what an ethical deployment and what a responsible deployment of this technology looks like. So I'm really excited for this panel. I hope it's maybe a little more interactive. One of the things that I really like about ethics is that everybody has kind of a valid intuition about what the right answer is and how they feel. So I hope everybody feels free to jump in if they have thoughts. So just to frame how I've been thinking about blockchain ethics recently, I sort of internally break it down into 3 different types of ethics. We have novel issues that arise because of blockchain, because of the unique affordances that blockchain has. We have ethical ideas that we currently have that we can use blockchain to actualize in more or less the same form. And then we also have ethical ideas and intuitions that are completely transformed by what blockchain is and what blockchain can do. So as I said, we have a great panel. I'm going to go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves here. So I think we can probably just go in sort of rough alphabetical order. So please just introduce yourself, everybody, say your name, your affiliation, and talk about what interests you about blockchain ethics. And then optionally, if you want, please give me your answer to the trolley problem. I used to do this to my students, and they hated it. So we'll see how it's how it's received here. So while you think about that, just for those who are maybe not as familiar, the trolley problem in 30 words is an ethical dilemma from the 60s. I think it was Philippa Foot who put it forward, and it basically says you're controlling a train, a trolley, and you're on a track. You're going down, and there are 5 people ahead of you on the track, and if you just keep going and don't do anything, you'll hit them and they'll all die. Or you can take the active step of moving onto a different track where there's 1 person, and you will kill that person and theoretically just be responsible for killing that 1 person. Everybody has their intuitions, everybody thinks they're right, but I hope that we're surprised by the different answers that we get. So first up in alphabetical order, I think is Ridge. So please.
Oh, well, thank you, Reuben. Nice to talk to you. Nice to see you, actually, after our conversation last week.
That's right.
And nice to meet and see all of you. So I'm a partner at Witherworldwide. It's a global law firm. I'm head of the corporate finance group, but I've been involved in corporate finance, M&A, corporate restructurings, internal investigations, the whole 9 yards. Because I think I'm probably older than most of you. So it just comes with age. So in any event, in the blockchain space, I've been interested in it for about 5 or 6 years. I actually had a charitable client who wanted to get into it early on, or relatively early on, with a reward token, and that kind of got me interested in it. Second client was interested in a gold-backed token. And once you start to get into it, all of a sudden you realize all the possibilities. I think Reuben captured it, and you all have captured it very well, as to the opportunities and the impact and the challenges are overwhelming. right, they're just huge, and I think they're going to be transformative. And once you start to get into it, it becomes addictive. So very much enjoy what I've heard so far, and looking forward to chatting with you all as we go along.
All right.
So actually, you want me to answer the question?
It's optional, but I would love it. So
isn't there a stop key?
Ridge, don't do this to me, Ridge. Come on. Let's
Okay, all right, I won't do that.
All right. Okay, so let's see. So I know Mihai is coming. I don't know if he's actually quite made it on. He's having technical difficulties. So I think it's probably best to skip him for now. And Raina, please.
Hi, yeah, you know, Steve just introduced me a few minutes ago. I'm Raina Haque, and I'm a professor at Duke Law. I'm visiting there, and I'm a resident professor at Wake Forest School of Law, and I teach about computational law, specifically for the last 2 years, blockchain technologies. And like Steve said, I also was the co-author for Blockchain Development and Fiduciary Duty, which was published with Stanford's Journal of Blockchain Law and Policy late last fall. So, you know, ethics is very interesting, especially, you know, like you said, Reuben, you know, people have like this intuition about like what's ethical, but then when we get together, we discover that there are all kinds of different ethical rubrics which could translate into different protocols, you know, that people find okay or not okay. And we see that too in the trolley problem too, where there's like this kind of this deontological outlook of like, okay, well, this is my duty versus like, you know, this idea towards consequence, like the greater good is, you know, what benefits the most people. So, you know, there's so many, those are two ways of looking at it. In my previous life too, I was studying Middle Eastern history, and then I realized like a lot of that language around ethics in those faiths isn't captured in what we're taught in Western ethics. So there's so many lenses in ethics that it makes for an interesting discussion, because we quickly realize that we're going to have to rely on something more than just intuition, particularly if we're hard coding into something that's supposed to run autonomously, or, you know, like supposed to be disintermediated. With my students, the way I kind of present these issues in the blockchain space is by going back to, you know, the fork in Ethereum, into Ethereum Classic or Ethereum. There were two ethical viewpoints there. One was, you know, one was immutability versus the other was like viability of a network. We want a network to stay robust with lots of users and participants, so we're willing to change the history of what happened. And the other was like, no, the whole point of blockchains are supposed to be stable, and that's what really keeps them viable. So we should keep this exploit in our history and have it happen. And then, you know, the ramifications of that when that community split. So, you know, there's a lot here, I think, with blockchain and ethics, and I think it's you know, it's very prescient for you to bring this up now as a topic for this conference.
Perfect. So then next up we have Rhys Lindmark, who he's on.
Exists. Yep.
Sure. All
Hello,
right.
Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's
Hello,
great.
everybody, and thank you, Reuben and Stephen and Stanford crew for setting this up together. My name is Rhys, and I previously worked at the MIT Digital Currency Initiative as the long-term societal impact person there, and I taught a class last semester actually on blockchain ethics. Yeah, and I think that for me, the reason why I'm interested in this is a lot of the reasons that my previous panelists said. There's a lot of juicy considerations here as we start to create this interesting new technology. And it's going to have, if it actually does what it claims to do, which is change this core primitive of money and trust in the world, then that could have some large impacts. So I think that I'm mostly thinking from like an applied ethics framework here, instead of the, like, technically I'm mostly like a consequentialist, but I'm mostly just using the term ethics because that's what people use for tech ethics or biotech ethics or AI ethics. But really, I just think we should put as much thought into making sure it affects people as positively as possible. Yes, that's me. And I would, from the trolley problem perspective, I would definitely, as a consequentialist, I just kill the least amount of people. So whatever I can do to make that happen, that's
Fantastic. All right, we will talk about that later. So next up we have Samuel, who I've seen online throughout the day. Samuel, are you still with us?
Yeah. Hi, Reuben. Hi. My name is Samuel. I'm based out of South Korea. It's morning time here. I'm an attorney at a law firm called Kim & Chang. It's the largest law firm in South Korea, and I have a team of a blockchain team. It's quite robust. I think a lot of the trends that you see globally regarding blockchain, you see it here right now. I think in general, I think South Korea is pretty far advanced compared to other jurisdictions. And so it's a pretty exciting place to be in terms of blockchain technology development and also the law. We recently, for the FATF, we have in Korea, they've established a task force to establish the rules and regulations regarding the travel rule for cryptocurrencies. And so that's a pretty exciting time here. Prior to being a lawyer, I used to be in the United States Army. I was a captain in the Military Intelligence Corps. And I think the most exciting time was I was a intelligence officer in the DMZ area here between North and South Korea. And after about 5 years, I left and went to law school, and I've been practicing New York, Hong Kong, Singapore right now, Seoul. And so regarding Reuben's trolley problem, I thought about it, and I guess going back to my experience, I guess, in the military, some of the discussions that we had regarding ethics in the military, especially in like war. I think this is one of those situations where you must reserve any moral judgment. I guess one of the examples that we discussed, which I abide by, is I think a good example is John McCain. When John McCain was a POW, he was captured and he was tortured, beyond any reasonable, like beyond my imagination. And there are certain points where he made statements that were sort of against the United States. He made statements that seemed to be that he was acquiescing to the demands of Vietnam, of the Vietnamese government, and making the United States look bad. And so the question was, how do we, he betrayed his country, quote unquote, betrayed his country through these written statements or verbal statements. And he was, in a sense, a broken person at that time because he'd been through so much torture. So should we, have a moral judgment on that? Or in other cases, when many of the military people who are in firefights and they kill innocent people, not, unintentionally, I'm sure we could always go back and look at things that they could have done better, preparation that they could then prevent these types of innocent civilians being killed. But I think in most of those cases where there's extreme pressure, very limited time to think about consciously about what to do, in those cases, I've come to a conclusion that those are the points in life where you should reserve any moral judgment. And so that's where I guess my position stands regarding the trolley problem.
Perfect.
I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. So it looks like we got Mihai joining. So Mihai, just to catch you up, we're just doing super quick introductions. What interests you about blockchain ethics? So let's just make sure. I saw you in here. Are you? Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hello, everyone. Happy to meet you all. Thank you very much, Reuben, for inviting me. I think, ethics is a very, very important part of our motivation for building the infrastructure that we're building. We started with Modex to build a blockchain database infrastructure because we wanted to see the concept of, we like to call it quantifiable trust, being widely adopted. And we really wanted to see the blockchain technology being kind of like widespread, because we strongly think that in this case, blockchain really resonates very well with the concept of trust. and we want to build trust which is not provided by a third party. We want to offer trust which is provided by a mathematical algorithm and by real proof. And I think going forward, ethics or tethics, you know, the concept in the Silicon Valley movie, is very well kind of like framed in the area of really proven proven work and proven technology that can really solve a problem. So my strong belief is that blockchain can play a significant role in providing trust. And in the next 10 years, I think we won't talk about trust like we talk today. We will just kind of like analyze some protocols and some real facts that will do the job for us. So that's the motivation. That's what I understand by ethics in our space. And we, with every action that we do in this space, we need to make sure that we contribute to this.
Great, thank you so much. So then last but certainly not least, we have Bryan Wilson. And Bryan and I have had in the past some really interesting discussions about computer ethics. And so I'm hoping that he'll give his introduction. I hope he talks about the trolley problem, but again, optional. And then, then he'll take us from computer ethics to blockchain ethics, I think. So.
Yes, definitely. So my name is Bryan Wilson, and I'm going to answer the questions a little bit out of order. I'll do the introduction and then the trolley analysis, and then into the computer ethics side of things. But I'm Bryan Wilson, as I mentioned. I am the editor-in-chief for the MIT Computational Law Report. Previously, I've worked in the startup space with an insurtech called Risk Genius that used AI to break down and quantify the language of insurance policies. I was a fellow with the ABA Center for Innovation, and I worked a little bit in the Kansas City government on some of the smart city and sharing economy initiatives that the city introduced back in 2015. To answer the trolley problem before diving into the rest of everything else, I'm going to start from the point of view of a person who is very into postmodern detective novels as a college student, and say that, you know, all of that meaning is kind of relative and it's impossible to define without any facts and circumstances. So, you know, thinking of it in one context, if the one person is like my wife or, you know, some child that I would have, you know, I would pretty strongly feel that I should, you know, save that over the 5 people, especially if I didn't know them or they were, you know, murderers or, you know, Hitler equivalents. So I think the context is important, but you know, in kind of hearkening back to the 3-tiered framework that you outlined at the beginning, which kind of touches on an idea of, you know, what Walter Maynard talked about, the uniqueness qualities of computer ethics, which is that, you know, there's this kind of componentized analysis that you can do where you look at the concept of computer ethics as, you know, something that, 1, is characterized by the primary and essential involvement of that technology, 2, it exploits some unique property of that technology, and 3, would not have arisen without the essential involvement of that technology. So it's transformed by the technology. And I think that, you know, that is very important because it helps us realize that the kind of back to what Marshall McLuhan was saying, you know, the medium is the message, or put another way, the messages that we have are going to necessarily be biased towards the medium that they're expressed in. So when you look at the concept of blockchain, you know, there are going to be completely different kind of standards that you would apply in these situations that you wouldn't apply in other situations, just because of those unique properties. So the question sort of becomes about, you know, how do you solve for this? Well, the question is, how can you identify what those unique properties are and kind of start to trace the different paths by which these unique circumstances arise? And I'm going to go into share screen and show you all briefly a page that's actually in the it's in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it kind of breaks down all of these different computer ethics situations where whether it's defining it, whether it's, you know, kind of looking at some of the foundations of it, the globalization of it, the strengths, the weaknesses, et cetera. But I think what would be really interesting is if we can, you know, all kind of come together, start focusing on what some of these unique pieces of blockchain ethics are, these pieces that aren't really addressed in, you know, the contemporary literature that is not inclusive of blockchain, and start to really create a rubric that can be used by regulators in the practice of regulatory design, so that we can get greater understanding around some of these, you know, with designing crypto regulations, for example, because I think that can be a very promising path forward.
All right. So given that, and given you know, the point of the summit and how we're thinking about the future and world building, I'll put the question to all of you. We know what blockchain looks like now, and we can sort of intuitively imagine what it will look like 10 years from now with no outside input, without, you know, without regulations, without any black swan changes. But what should blockchain look like, right? So how should we be applying it? How can we make sure that it's deployed responsibly? What does that responsible ethical deployment look like in the year 2030? And how is it different from where we're currently heading, if it's different at all?
Good question.
So I mean, I think one thing that we could say is that, you know, it does look like a more populated kind of version of this chart that we're trying to imagine. You know, so looking at blockchain specifically, you can start to identify, you know, there are these unique ways to store it. There are these unique ways to design it so that it consumes energy at a level that, you know, is bad for the environment, that it consumes energy in a way that's less bad for the environment, but less trustworthy. And we can start to at least, you know, have an honest apples to apples sort of discussion about the topic. And I think, you know, as we get closer and closer to 2030, maybe that's something that's like a tool that we could have is, you know, some page that's like the one that I saw Anastasia linked to in the Zoom chat for computer ethics.
Okay, so this is an application. This is saying we need to have, and this goes back to the climate conversation that we're having, where it really comes down to data. In your eyes, it comes down to.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else have a vision of what blockchain should be 10 years out?
Blockchain hopefully will be even well regulated by then, so the governance part can be built into so developers will know what they have to put into a program, make it compliant with whatever regulations it's going to fall prey to. And also they can leave some hooks in there. I'm a programmer. They can leave ways so that customizations that happen in the future, new regulations, can be easily incorporated in a blockchain. Another beauty of blockchain that I think is going to be great is the fact that we'll be able to own things in a better way. We'll be able to own our data in a better way. We'll be able to expose that which we want to expose. Our identities will be better. We'll be able to expose any part of our identity that I want to. In a health crisis, we'll be able to show anybody who needs to know just a little bit about our health information, maybe anonymizing it to a point where it doesn't really invade our privacy. Maybe hopefully global privacy laws will happen. We have a GDPR, we have a patchwork of legislation here in the United States. All needs to come together because I do contracts, and every contract has 5 sections, one that deals with the privacy of each individual area where that product or service is deployed. And that's crazy. It's going to create lots of problems. We need to come to some place like that. And blockchain is the new database. Blockchain, as you all know, provides all the immutability, lots of the trustworthiness, all the things that we need to make all those things happen. So in 10 years, hopefully, matured. Its development it's down to 2 or 3 development environments where it's interoperable. We'll be able to share blockchain data between the off-chain world and the on-chain world in a way that is well done. And that's my hope for the next 10 years. I think that's possible. You know, I think the way that things are moving, I think that's a possible.
Yeah, this is Sam. I think for me, I think we, you know, right now in the current stage of blockchain, I think we are closer to the dial-up days of the internet. But I guess in the future, my perspective is that I think the trilemma will be solved. I think it will be one of the second generation blockchains that will be the standard, the blockchain adopted by the world. Such like MySpace was the first generation social network, and then Facebook is the current dominant, and also Yahoo and Google. There may be like pockets of regional blockchains that may be more suitable to each region, such as like in Korea, Google's not popular, but Naver, the Korean version of the search engine, is popular. I see blockchain also permitting more of a decentralized corporate culture. You know, what we're doing right now, you know, even a law firm, any corporation, we're doing it. We're not meeting in person. We're doing it remotely in different scattered locations. And so I see more of a decentralization of corporate organization. And also, I think the final thing is the rise of the security tokens. I think it's going to happen maybe not in the near future, but eventually, where you'll be issuing securities in a version of tokens where you could get your dividends in the form of token payments. You could do your, you could vote on through the security token of your shareholder votes. All the articles of incorporation, the bylaws will be on the token, on the blockchain. It'll be more of a decentralized. You'll take away intermediaries such as payment companies like DB or Boni, who takes these, organizes these dividend payments or interest payments to shareholders or bondholders, and you won't need that anymore. So I see that in the future in the next 10, 20 years.
So I think my outlook maybe is a bit like Sam's, but I don't see one unifying chain. I think if anything, time shows more differentiation between people and a re-scrambling. So before, when scrambling may have, or we might have found unity within like physical jurisdictions, I think we're finding more and more that unity is, cross-jurisdictional, but then, differing according to ideologies. And I think if we have different chains with different protocols, which have different answers to the trolley problem, like people are going to choose which chain speaks to them. And maybe they'll even switch over for other use cases to different chains, whichever one, suits their needs more, depending on the protocol. It's hard to talk about blockchain because we haven't really defined it. Even in this discussion that we have right now, like, are we talking about public chains, private chains? We're talking about enterprise chains. I don't foresee one chain ruling them all and all of us being happy with that. I don't see that in 10 years. I think there are going to be different chains with different protocols that people will use for different reasons. My hope is that the general public will be more educated about these different choices and the trade-offs, and maybe a bit more tech savvy too, to have to kind of trust the experts less and do some of their own due diligence for themselves. That's my hope. I'm not sure if we're going to get there in 10 years, but I don't see the one chain to rule them all scenario happening 10 years from now, maybe farther out, once we've done a lot of once we've had more crashes and burns and people have had their different input for what works really well and what doesn't, and we've seen the space mature, maybe like 50 years from now, that's something, but I don't see that 10 years from now.
So if I can I think you're sort of hit on a really good point. So it strikes me we're talking about two different kinds of chains, right? One is a chain is a tool. It's a database. It's a way to send information or a payment or security or whatever it happens to be from one person to another. And that's really, in that context, it's a tool, and maybe there's a communication element to it. The other, and maybe this gets to DAOs and other areas of the blockchain, is where it becomes a governing or organizing principle. And I think there are very different dynamics in each one, right? It's easy to say, hey, look, blockchain's great because I can store data and send it, rather than sending a fax. It's another thing to say, hey, I'm going to live according to a certain set of immutable principles, because I think those are, humans have been trying to come up with principles to live by for 100,000 years, and I'm not sure we're going to get there in the next 10. And actually, a lot of the principles that we live by have a lot of judgment in them, right? And blockchain or a code really doesn't, at least currently, allow for that. Even when we do a contract, right? Lots of times we'll do a contract and deliberately put vague provisions in it because it's not worth the time and the effort to try and figure out how we would sort out every foreseeable issue that can come up, and it's both a waste of resources, a waste of time, and probably there were things we wouldn't agree to as we get through that in any event. So if they're deemed to be reasonably remote risks, then you sort of leave it vague, and if that situation comes up, then it does. And I think the same is true when you think about general laws that apply throughout our culture, right? You go to a judge, and the judge has discretion. He can look at the circumstances and say, I think a penalty for this particular event or this particular circumstances is X, whereas something similar, because of the way the relevant person acted, it might be a different penalty, right? And we ask juries actually to do that every day when for example, when they have to assess somebody's state of mind in connection with a crime. So I think we have to be very careful about what kind of blockchains we're talking about.
One thing I think that at least the last two speakers, and I think everybody kind of touched on, is that it's a little bit unclear where the metes and bounds are of what this thing is that we call a blockchain. But there are still a couple of features that we can still sort of agree tend to be features of blockchains. So one of the questions that we're going to have to think about as we come up over the next 10 years is, to what extent are these features potential pitfalls in our system? So Rich, you mentioned the fact that there's some inflexibility that's built into code. And what does that mean for this idea of code is law? I think Joseph talked about immutability, and I think we all tend to think about that as something that's inherent in blockchains. But then we run into problems where there's child pornography on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain. We run into issues with the right to disappear and or the right to be forgotten and the right to erasure. So despite these things being core components of what we currently think of as a blockchain, to what extent do we have an obligation to say this is not something that we necessarily want to move forward with, and we don't want in 10 years? And that's for anybody.
So you could say, hey, look, I want a blockchain, but I want a way to I guess appeal to some organization, right? To say,
and is that still a blockchain, right?
Is that still a blockchain? Because then it's not entirely decentralized, right? That's right. And it may be that the idea of pure decentralization is actually not consistent with human nature. Right? I mean, pure decentralization ultimately gets you to pure anarchy at some point, right? I mean, I think that's kind of where somebody was going to when they talked about, hey, one of the things we find sometimes is that you could actually align with different blockchains for different purposes. And if we all individually align with different and identify with different, chains, if you will, for different aspects of our life, then you're really getting into an anarchistic situation. I'm not using that in a political sense, so I'm just using that in a sense as a very highly fragmented sense. So it may be that, just given the nature of human beings and the ability to look, or the need to be able to look back and say, "Oop, I did that wrong," or "Oop, I changed my mind," is something that we have to accommodate in the rules that we set for this. And I do think ultimately that the industry, blockchain development, would actually benefit from regulation. Right. One of the issues we have with decentralization is everybody can do everything, right? And there's so many choices and there's so many decisions that you have to make with every chain that you want to create, that actually it becomes kind of an obstacle. If every time you have to start new on every issue, if there aren't guideposts, it can become an obstacle development instead of regulation being the obstacle. Right? Unlimited freedom can be an obstacle to development. I guess what I'm saying.
So
not that I'm really in favor of a lot of regulation. Don't get me wrong.
So jumping in a little bit, I think that there's also an opportunity to kind of like design some of these human factors into protocols like DAOs where it's, distributed sort of governance, so that you are actively embracing the humans in the loop. There are also ways that you could do this with, for example, smart contracts. Shane and Coney and David Hoffman had a really good paper about transactional scripts and contract stacks, and I'm going to link to it in the chat right now. But it kind of provides an overview for the different sorts of ways that you can, represent some of these things in a bigger kind of architecture that's not just isolated as, a set of code that's off in space somewhere, and once it starts running, it can't stop running. We can design these kind of human safeguards into some of these processes. And I think, the conservative and kind of gradual development of some of these systems would kind of start automating those pieces that we're a little bit comfortable with, testing out some of the features that we're less comfortable with in low stakes environments. Like I think, for example, with like CryptoKitties, they're doing a lot of really interesting work with the way that you can like represent identity in these different contexts and buy and sell assets in these different kind of bundles. And if we use that as kind of like a proxy for, what identity could be like at a larger level, that helps us kind of inform some of these, some of the more experimental kind of pie in the sky goals that, a lot of people in the space have.
Yeah, so coming back to your pie in the sky approach, we have a more practical approach, and there I strongly believe that there's still a non-captured value in blockchain as database. As we're moving fastly from an internet of data to an internet of value, I think the first real application of blockchain should be in the area of blockchain as the new database. And this is exactly where you can implement like rules and smart contracts, but on private blockchains that are really easy to use in the enterprise space. So the way I see it is that there's a lot of uncaptured value in this first step of private blockchains that really solve a managerial problem or a communication problem in some small kind of like environments. So I think we should really focus on what we can capture from private blockchains or from blockchain as database today, and then, kind of like build on it going further.
I like, Mihai, I really like what you said. Actually, some of the first applications I looked or was working on, and I'm a patent attorney too, like that's the other hat I wear, is kind of on this idea of subordinate chains and dominant chains. And so that's really looking at like a big dominant chain that everyone has some buy-in to should have limited functionality, right? Because as a group, there's very little that we should be able to agree on. That's just what happens. But then like on private chains, that's where you can see maybe more nuance and more functionality and more interesting things happening. But that's a group that selects into those smaller private chains. But maybe there's like an artifact from that chain that you want to put on the public chain just to show like this actually did happen, or the hash of this did happen at some point in time. I see that as probably the most realistic, architecture that's widespread and viable in the next 10 years. Because that way we're not all radically agreeing to like, or no, we're not all agreeing to one very huge new protocol like a religion. I mean, that's just not going to happen with the way we are right now. But I think that seems the most realistic and feasible to me, for it to be first focused on data in the next 10 years. And that's how we're seeing people using blockchains and how blockchains are interacting with each other.
This is exactly what we build. It's a hybrid middleware between a blockchain, a consensus of a blockchain, and the data. And I think there's so much value in concepts like these spread out around the world that we should kind of like capture the maximum value out of it. And I fully agree with you.
Just to bring in
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, to bring in another perspective from an engineering point of view, is touching back on a point I made earlier in the day around this technology, what is a blockchain, viewing it more as a coordination technology. And in specific, the ability to coordinate not just people, but also legal fictions, machines such as IoT to receive signals and to actuate. So this brings it closer to the trolley problem. So a car, for example, what decision does it make to protect the passengers or the people on the street? And also to coordinate algorithms in general, because they're distributed algorithms that may be crossing agency or trust boundaries. So viewed in that light, we're very much in the form of cyber physical systems. And I noticed in the Computer Information and Ethics paper from the Stanford one there, it's got a strong reference to cybernetics and Norbert Wiener's work around all that sort of the initial seeds from these sort of things. Now within cyber physical systems and generally systems engineering, there's a whole discipline around ethics of like doing, how do we build a bridge? How do we build a road so that it's safe, etc. There's a lot of principles that can be borrowed or brought into the same sort of argument saying, well, what we're engineering here are new economic systems, small microeconomic systems with this technology called a blockchain, which happens to, from a database sense of the world, preserve state. So preserve state of our economy of which we're building. So from an ethical standpoint, we can borrow a lot of the work that's coming from ethics around systems engineering generally and the cyber physical systems. So some of the sort of work like the IEEE have done quite a bit in that sort of area, but there's also the National Society for Professional Engineers that sort of have a lot of sort of ethics side of things to it. And so how this sort of can relate down to very, very nuanced sort of very specific problems, like the notion of immutability is actually more of an emergent property of a given network. It's not inherent in any particular blockchain. Because if I have, in the case of Bitcoin, over 51% of the hash power, I can rewrite history. So technically, a Bitcoin blockchain is not immutable inherently. It's an emergent property of the fact that there's a distributed set of miners that are competing to mint new coins, etc. And likewise with code deployment, and a lot of these sort of issues are coming around in terms of if you're running a bit of code, how do you know it's actually from a genuine source, or is the genuine bit of code that's actually doing what I ask it to do? So there's a lot of work going on in terms of very low level sort of trusted platforms at a hardware level to be able to sign in code that's coming through to be deployed into IoT sort of environments. The same sort of issue, etc., rears its head in blockchain implementations, like either permissioned or fully private. That's all I'll sort of stay there.
Hey, Robert, is it possible to both learn from those sources and also look at, for example, I'll say the Facebook and some of the social media issues that have come up and say, okay, we actually have two models we can follow. One is here's what's happened. Here's in this, I'll say the IEEE has come up with a program or an approach to ethics, whereas in the social media sphere we didn't do that. And so you can use both learning to try and figure out what, from a blockchain point of view, would be the things that we both learn positively in one and learn negatively from the other.
I think we're probably more able to actually learn in the blockchain space because so much of it's already open and largely, primarily transparent. So there's opportunities to learn from mistakes. I mean, if you take the DAO attack, for example, the nascent community at that time learned a heck of a lot about code quality. So as a result, there became a whole lot of interest in formal methods. Something I never expected to see for a long time, which is how can we pre-validate sort of the quality of our code before we actually, the specifications that they will do what we want them to do before we actually even implement the code. And then when we have implemented the code, we can therefore go back and say, does it meet the specifications? Right? So formal methods takes a long time, is not widely practiced in general software engineering. It is practiced in control systems. But that came from a rocket exploding, the Ariane 1 or 5 or something else like that, because of an error in the code. And a few billion euro went up in smoke in a few seconds. And so that started to justify the use of formal methods in that type of space, which then crossed over into aircraft control systems and would suggest that Boeing didn't really kind of follow good practice in recent cases. But one of the things, if you look at civil aviation, is whenever there's a crash, there's this whole international body that can come together and investigate that crash and learn from it. And you're sort of seeing that a lot within the blockchain space, is because so much of it's open, there is a rapid learning cycle, both in terms of what can we do from an innovation point of view, but then there's also a certain group that is sort of saying, actually, how can we improve the quality of what we're doing? And that's what you're seeing come through. So better programming languages, for example, to avoid common sort of errors starting to emerge, such as opposed to Solidity, you've got something like Viper, for example, that has got better constructions to try and avoid some of the errors that might crop up in software. So it's all those sort of things. And the ethics aspect here comes from doing the systems engineering before you actually deploy code, move fast and break things kind of situations. So there's sort of that dichotomy that's going to pan out here.
Got it.
Hi, this is Sam. I just wanted to share, I would like to get your thoughts as well. I'm not a coder, and so I can't speak to how code works, but I just have a question. You know, my thinking is a little bit more simplistic, where I try to separate technology. I guess my view that I shared with Reuben was like technology is morally neutral. It's neither good nor bad. I guess it's like saying, is the internet ethical? That's the way I thought of the question. Because, you know, as a basis for me, as a starting point for any ethical situation, the technology needs, there needs to be some sort of consciousness, and the technology has no consciousness. So the way I look at it is really, you know, who's the user and who's the creator, and you know, they're the ones who have the moral, ethical obligations. And I guess, you know, going back to an example of a gun or a knife, you know, the gun or the knife, it can be used for good or bad. The gun itself or the knife itself has no moral judgment. It's really the user or who the manufacturer of the gun or the knife is that has the you know, the moral obligation. And I think it goes back to one of his Reuben's point regarding like being pseudonymous. Is that good or bad? Like cryptography. And I guess my position would be that, well, it's neither good or bad. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad, but the technology itself is just morally neutral. And, you know, and so that's where I thought about this question that Reuben had. So I'll pause there.
That's kind of an interesting one, because I totally agree that technology is largely neutral in that sense, but a decision to build a piece of technology, to write a bit of code, isn't. We make those sort of choices. And do we make those implicit or do we make them explicit? So in the case of anonymous sort of transactions, Zcoin, Zcash, sorry, is making a choice around, or Mondex and, Monero, are making choices around privacy preserving of transactions. But they're quite explicit about that. And there's a cost in doing that, both in terms of usability, computational cost, but also, you know, the ethical question, because what do you enable? And I personally can't say which one's wrong or right on any of those, just as long as those choices are made somewhat explicit and the trade-offs are quite clear.
Yeah.
Is about as best as I can sort of frame it.
And I think, you know, how it differs from, you know, the physical object of a knife or a gun is that a blockchain is a network that requires buy-in as well. So there's this other party, so to speak, than just the user and the maker. It's this community too that's coalescing around it and keeping that network viable as well. And, you know, I mean, I think in other disciplines too, we see like, okay, there's this idea of majority rule, so to speak, but then what are the unintended consequences of that too? And that also applies to, I think public blockchains, especially if we are intending for them to take on more transactions than, simply storing data or, very simple cryptocurrency transactions. When we're building up to that too, the number of unintended consequences will go up as well. And then, to what extent are we okay with majority rule in all cases? And we were talking about, child pornography on, what was it, Bitcoin Cash before. Like maybe there are certain things, it doesn't matter if everyone buys into it, we still don't want that. There's a reason to not have that on a chain, even if other people are okay with running the other components of the chain.
Yeah, actually, I think that point's well taken, because you can take your knife and your gun analogy and then say, okay, well, what about a nuclear bomb, right? I mean, we all have nuclear bombs. I mean, at some level, buy-in, should there be some control over and above just the buy-in and the fact that you can do it? I think, was it Robert that said, hey, it's not just a neutral technology in the sense that whoever or whatever somebody starts a program for is actually making an ethical decision.
All right,
Yeah.
so, oh, sorry.
Yeah, by the way, I didn't mean to drop the bomb there, so okay.
Good point. I think we should first centralize in order to decentralize. So we should first control the rules of building infrastructures like this, that are really good for the society. And I think regulation plays a significant point over here. We've passed through a regulation process, and believe me, the regulators are looking at absolutely every piece of code that you've built over there. And they are basically reviewing absolutely every backdoor that you could leave over there. So it's an extra measurement that would help tremendously. And 99% of the frauds in this space or the misusages would have been solved. If we're talking about ethics, I think regulation for the short term is the only way, strong regulation in which we can really build something that is really beneficial.
Interesting.
There's also a hybrid approach, because going back to what Sam said, I do agree that there has to be a component of technology neutrality with respect to regulation. In some ways, regulating the activities is an easy way to approach it, just the outcomes, right? But at the same time, there are certain platforms that might exclusively, maybe not exclusively, but the majority uses might be for ill results or ill gains. And in those cases, perhaps a certain measure of discrimination against a certain tech or platform might be suitable. So I think, because you can't regulate every single platform just based on this constructive approach of its own characteristics. There's just not enough resources. But outcomes, a technology neutral kind of outcome result-based approach combined with kind of having an eye out for the worst actors might be a good, exclusively bad actors might be a good way to handle things.
Yeah, and that kind of touches on the idea that there are, that there has to be a trade-off necessarily between norms and, adoption, because it could be the case that the way to fast forward to adoption for some of this stuff is to, really promote illegal activities, because, this can be a way to obscure things. But as a society, I think we would all agree that that is not like a desirable thing that we would like just for the technology to work. And so, I think taking like the idea of analogizing where we currently are to where we want to be, and kind of identifying and isolating what the role of blockchain can, like what it can, what kind of form it can manifest in is, it's going to be up to us, and it's going to be kind of a big question.
Sure, but I fully agree that like in real life, we have the highways and we have the country roads. So if you want to go on a highway, the highway should be like really regulated, and that's the kind of like the government approach. And if you want to take any other road, then it's on your risk, and yeah.
Yeah, so maybe something like a nutrition label for blockchains that kind of clearly specifies, different properties about it can be useful in at least informing people of what some of these risks are, so that it is a much more kind of arm's length transaction whenever you find yourself in one of these situations.
So Bryan, is there a difference between putting that information out there in a way that's sort of intentionally digestible and just putting the information out there, right? So I think that arguably something, you know, in a situation like the DAO, the information was there. Anybody could have gone and found that exploit, and actually people, you know, noticed it before it actually turned into a problem. So there's this weird tension between information and information being sort of constructively accessible. And this gets back to the notion of transparency. And the reason why I'm asking you about this is because you seem to be really focused on data, which I really appreciate. But there is a tension in blockchain because I can't remember who said it, maybe Joseph or Robert pointed out that there's a pseudonymity angle, but also there's an openness. So one of the questions that we have to ask going forward is, we have a technology, it's built on cryptography, which is designed to hide information as you know, as much as possible, but at the same time being really open and public. Are we hiding the right information, and do we have the right information available, or is there some balance that needs to be shifted?
I think that's a good question. I think it comes back to, you know, kind of this idea of having good UI, UX for a lot of these technologies. Because, you know, it's not just that we can have a good UI, UX for blockchain, it's that we can have a legally digestible UI, UX for blockchain. We can have like a human digestible kind of UI, UX for blockchain, and we can have like a programmatic sort of UI, UX for blockchain. And I think if you look at the systems that are most, that have been most widely adopted and that are the most successful, like in the general context of, you know, just computing technologies, those that are the easiest to use, that are transparent, I think they've nailed something that others haven't. And, you know, I don't know that it's something that you can exactly regulate or kind of enforce, but it will require some of these conversations and this kind of collaborative world building that we're all here doing right now, in order to kind of surface what the components of that are, and hopefully get enough people to realize that, you know, hey, this can be a good practice, and kind of like buy into this, so that we have systems that people are familiar with, people are comfortable with, and people trust a little bit more.
So can I just ask, isn't a corollary of having a notice and disclosure also that somebody's responsible if the disclosure or the notice is inadequate? And that's a hard part with a, you know, cryptographic system where everybody's anonymous.
This brings up another point in terms of, like, if you took it from a civil engineering point of view, bridges to cross some sort of expanse. All of us as non-civil engineers will recognize the affordance of a bridge and says, hey, I can cross it. I don't know how that bridge is built. I don't know whether it's structurally sound or anything else like that. I can just see it and I can reach my target of where I want to go, my goal that I want to achieve. But if that bridge collapses, right, there is an engineering profession or there that holds the engineers and the decisions that they made in engineering that bridge to account, to make it accountable. So you could pursue what was going on. So an example of that was with the Christchurch earthquakes a few years ago here in New Zealand. One relatively new building collapsed. And so obviously there became a full investigation into the engineers, etc., around who was responsible for designing this building that should have been up to earthquake standards in New Zealand, which are quite robust, yet it fell down. So the same sort of notion of software engineering ethics and etc., there's also got to be a notion of accountability that goes into it and what decisions can be made. This kind of runs counter to the notion of what we're trying to do in terms of discovering more innovation and bringing new ideas to the market. Because how do we know whether they're going to work or not? We don't yet. And so largely you can argue that a lot of the early developments within the blockchains, particularly around the ICO stuff, while it was pretty scammy in its sort of nature, etc., it was exploring a whole lot of new ideas, and it did raise the attention of regulators, etc., to come in and start trying to change things around, to move things around, etc. So there's always this sort of balancing act that's occurring. How, in terms of holding engineers to account, not strictly anonymous. And indeed, there's a degree of centralization of taking Bitcoin, for example. There is a core team that is part of, have commit access to the Bitcoin source code. And actually, I recall around 2014, maybe 2013, a couple of the core team at the time actually removed themselves from the core team because of liability issues around what they were building. I can't remember too much, but there's some examples.
Yeah, the same thing has happened on Ethereum. Actually, one of my kind of first introductions into the blockchain world was writing an EIP that caused one of the core engineers to resign, which was a rough introduction. Unfortunately, so I think if anybody has just a last word, we're officially out of time. I got to question 2, so I feel like we went about how I thought it was going to. So if there are any last words, please feel free, and you can have the floor. Otherwise, we have a really great panel coming up next about automated and autonomous legal entities. But any last words?
I'd just like to pop in and say that if anyone is interested in kind of exploring this idea of how we could represent the idea of blockchain ethics in a way that kind of parallels what has been done historically with computer ethics, I'd be interested to connect and kind of set something up so we can collaborate on something and kind of map that out a little bit, because I think it would be really interesting and could surface some insights that could help regulators, potentially could help a lot of people, a lot of the different stakeholders in this space kind of understand everything a little bit more and learn what some of these, positive design patterns might be, so that the rate of adoption can hopefully go up in a positive way.
Great. So Bryan, we'll make sure information about that ends up, I suppose, in the Slack. There's an ethics channel. But Ridge, Raina, Mihai, Rhys, Bryan, and Samuel, thank you so much. This was amazing. And, Dazza is up next, so we're all in for a treat. That was a little preview of the magic that is Dazza.
Perfect.
Thanks for having us.
Well done.
Right on.
Thank you, Reuben. That was great.
It's a great panel.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. I just wanted to say, with that project, Bryan, and with I think several others, we'll just be touching base during the closing session on next steps and various different projects that people can get involved with. I see potentially an emergent need for a professional body regulating certain kinds of blockchain engineers, maybe the highway blockchain engineers, and looking at some of the earlier discussions, specifically, for example, around climate data regulation, blockchains that are being used for certain very specific areas of regulation. It may be that there's certain kinds of, again, very subject matter specific contextual things that we can sort of grip in a more sort of certain way, but start applying some of these principles. But again, thank you so much. That was a fantastic discussion. And I think some of that will flow on into the next discussion, but I'm really, really